The siren blared, cutting through the quiet morning like a knife. Red and blue lights flashed, casting an eerie glow across the windows of the school bus and illuminating the tense faces of the students inside. Everything happened so fast, and the driver, Mr. Harris, barely had time to register what was going on. His hands gripped the steering wheel, his gaze flicking to the rearview mirror where he could see the confused, worried faces of the kids. "What's happening, Mr. Harris?" A small voice piped up from the front row. It was Lily, a quiet girl who usually buried herself in a book whenever she got on the bus. "I don't know, honey. Just stay seated. Everything's going to be okay." Mr. Harris tried to keep his voice steady, but his heart was pounding. He knew those hard, unyielding expressions on the officers' faces as they approached the bus. This wasn't the first time he'd been in this kind of situation, but this time, the kids were here. He didn't want them to see this, but there was no way to turn back now. One of the officers, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark blue uniform, stood just outside the bus door, rapping sharply on the glass with a look that made Mr. Harris's stomach tighten. Mr. Harris took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he reached over to open the bus door. The kids behind him fell silent, their eyes wide, watching every move. He could sense their fear, and he wished he could shield them from what was about to unfold. But he knew there was no hiding it now. The officer outside climbed up the first step, towering over Mr. Harris with a hardened expression. "License and registration," he demanded, his tone clipped and cold, as if speaking to someone who'd already done something wrong. Mr. Harris nodded, moving slowly to take his wallet from his pocket, doing everything deliberately to avoid escalating the situation. "Here you go, officer," he said calmly, handing over his papers. He tried to meet the officer's eyes, searching for even a hint of understanding or kindness. But the officer's gaze remained fixed, unforgiving. As the officer examined the documents, a murmur swept through the bus. Mr. Harris glanced back, giving the kids a reassuring nod, hoping to ease their worries. "It's all right, everyone. Just a routine check. Stay calm." But he wasn't calm, not even close. He could feel his heart racing as the officer paused, squinting at his license with a skeptical frown. "Step out of the vehicle," the officer barked, and Mr. Harris felt his stomach drop. Step out? With the kids watching? His pulse quickened, but he kept his face neutral. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, keeping his voice steady despite the tightness in his throat. The officer ignored his question. "I said step out of the vehicle," he repeated louder this time. Mr. Harris noticed a few of the kids reaching for their phones, capturing the scene with worried glances. One of the boys, Jamal, whispered to his friend in the back, his voice barely audible. "Why are they treating him like that? He didn't do anything wrong." Hearing Jamal's words stung. Mr. Harris could feel the kids' confusion and anger building, a silent protest growing in their young eyes. He had always tried to be a positive presence in their lives, the adult they could count on. But here he was, facing humiliation and suspicion, right in front of them. It broke his heart, but he knew he had to comply. With slow, measured steps, he climbed down from the bus, feeling every set of eyes on him. The second officer, shorter and stockier, motioned for him to move to the front of the bus. Mr. Harris placed his hands on the hood, feeling the cool metal against his palms, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Behind him, he heard Lily's voice, quiet but resolute. "They can't treat him like this. He's our driver. He's a good man." The officers looked over, and for a moment, a tense silence filled the air. Mr. Harris felt a swell of pride mixed with anxiety. He appreciated Lily's bravery, but he feared what might come next. The taller officer's eyes narrowed as he glared at the kids through the bus windows. "Everyone stay seated," he barked, his voice echoing down the rows of seats. The kids froze, but one of them, Jamal, kept his phone held high, filming the entire encounter. "You have no right to do this," Jamal called out defiantly, his young voice filled with indignation. Mr. Harris didn't do anything wrong. The officer's face flushed with anger. "Put that phone away," he snapped, starting to step toward the bus door. Mr. Harris felt a surge of protectiveness. He couldn't let the officer intimidate the kids. "They're just kids, officer. They don't mean any harm," he said, his voice firm yet calm. The officer's gaze shifted back to Mr. Harris, and his tone grew sharper. Hands back on the hood, he ordered, stepping closer. Mr. Harris complied, pressing his hands firmly against the bus, his face tense but controlled. He knew that one wrong word could make things worse, but he could feel the kid's courage feeding his own. Jamal's voice broke the silence again, determined and unyielding. "We have every right to record this," he said, holding his phone steady. The officer glanced back, annoyance flashing across his face, but he seemed to hesitate, realizing the situation was slipping from his control. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Mr. Harris could hear the muffled sounds of other kids whispering, voices rising in unity. This was no longer just a routine stop. The kids weren't going to stay silent, and neither was he. A small spark of defiance grew within him. "They're watching," he thought, "and they need to see me stand strong." Mr. Harris stood there, his palms pressed firmly against the hood of the bus, every muscle tense as he felt the eyes of his young passengers fixed on him. He knew he couldn't let this moment shake him, not in front of the kids who looked up to him, who trusted him to keep them safe. The officer with the crew cut leaned in close, his voice a low, mocking tone. "Driving this bus legally, are you? Doesn't exactly look like you belong here." Mr. Harris's jaw clenched, but he kept his voice steady, refusing to let his anger show. "I've got all the paperwork you need," he replied, keeping his gaze ahead, refusing to give the officer the satisfaction of a reaction. Meanwhile, inside the bus, the kids whispered among themselves, their eyes wide with disbelief and growing indignation. Jamal muttered to his friends, "This isn't right. Mr. Harris always looks out for us. He's never done anything wrong." Another student, Maya, bit her lip, clutching her phone tightly. "We have to do something. He's always been there for us." Lily, normally so quiet, surprised everyone by lifting her head, her voice clear and steady. "Maybe it's time we stand up for him." Outside, Mr. Harris felt a wave of warmth at the sound of Lily's words, though he kept his focus on the officer. The taller officer took a step back, glancing at the second officer as they exchanged a look. For a split second, Mr. Harris dared to think maybe, just maybe, they'd back down. But then, the shorter officer with the mustache smirked and crossed his arms. "We'll be taking you in for some further questioning, just to be safe," he announced loudly, as if to assert his authority over the situation. "Kids will just have to wait for another driver to take them to school." The words hit Mr. Harris like a punch to the gut. His mind raced. He couldn't just leave the kids here, stranded and frightened, uncertain of what was happening to him. He'd worked so hard to give them stability, to be the one adult they could rely on each morning. Inside the bus, Jamal felt a surge of anger, his hands clenching around his phone. "They're not taking him," he muttered to himself, loud enough for the others to hear. Maya, sitting beside him, nodded fiercely. "We're not letting them treat him like this. Not today." As if on cue, several kids in the back of the bus raised their phones, pointing them toward the officers. They'd been filming all along, but now their stance had shifted from observers to silent witnesses of injustice. Their young faces, usually filled with laughter and playfulness, were now resolute, a quiet defiance etched in their eyes. The mustached officer noticed the kids with their phones, his eyes narrowing in irritation. "Put those phones away," he barked, stepping closer to the bus door. But Jamal, with a rare fire in his eyes, stood his ground. "We're not putting them away. We've got every right to record this." His voice was strong, unwavering. Mr. Harris's heart swelled with pride and concern. He wanted to tell them to stop, to stay safe, but he could feel the power of their support coursing through him. They weren't backing down, and neither could he. His voice cut through the tense air, steady but carrying the weight of years of endurance. "They're just kids, officer. They're not hurting anyone." The officer's jaw tightened, his authority slipping as he glanced uneasily at the phones pointed his way. The second officer seemed to hesitate, realizing they were losing control of the narrative. What had started as a routine power play was now a spectacle, a standoff with a group of kids who refused to be intimidated. Lily, still clutching her phone, felt a surge of courage she'd never felt before. With a clear, calm voice, she said, "Mr. Harris is our driver. He's always there for us. Why can't you just leave him alone? Her words hung in the air, a simple question that cut through the tension. The officers shifted, momentarily thrown off guard by the small girl's earnestness. Mr. Harris looked back at her, his heart swelling with gratitude. He'd been there for them every day, but today, they were here for him. One of the officers muttered something to the other, casting an uncertain glance at the gathering phones and fierce, unblinking eyes of the kids who refused to let this moment pass quietly. The silence on the bus was electric. Every child was on edge, their eyes flicking back and forth between Mr. Harris and the officers. Even though they were young, they understood something bigger was happening, something wrong, and they were determined not to let it pass. The officers, caught off guard by the kids' united front, exchanged glances. The taller one, trying to regain control, leaned closer to Mr. Harris and sneered. "You think a few kids with phones are going to change anything here?" But Mr. Harris, feeling the strength radiating from his young passengers, stood taller. "I think these kids know when they're seeing something that isn't right," he replied calmly, locking eyes with the officer. He could feel a subtle shift in power. These kids, his kids, weren't backing down, and neither was he. At that moment, Jamal, who'd been recording everything, leaned out of his seat, voice strong and defiant. "You can't treat him like this," he called out, his voice echoing in the stillness of the bus. "We're not scared of you." The officer's face reddened, clearly frustrated, but he was visibly unsettled by the chorus of support. One by one, the other kids began voicing their support, their young voices blending together, small but resolute. "He's done nothing wrong," Maya shouted, her usual quiet demeanor replaced with a fierceness that took even her by surprise. "Yeah, he's the best driver we've ever had," called out another boy, fists clenched in anger. The taller officer's smirk faded, replaced with a frown. He raised his hand as if to order the kids to quiet down, but Jamal cut him off with a single sentence. "We're posting this." The officer froze, his hand lingering in midair, as if he was weighing his next move. This was no longer a simple act of intimidation. It was becoming a public display, and he knew it. Mr. Harris felt his heart swell with pride. He'd spent years teaching these kids to stand up for what was right, to trust their own voices, and now, in this moment of need, they were doing exactly that. He turned, looking each one of them in the eyes, nodding slightly, as if to say, "Thank you." But the officer wasn't done yet. In a last-ditch effort to regain his authority, he barked out, "I can still have all of you removed from this bus." Jamal, undeterred, gave a fearless smile. "Then what, officer? You gonna arrest a bus full of kids for standing up for their driver?" A ripple of laughter spread through the bus. The tension cracked, and for the first time, a glimmer of humor broke through the seriousness. Even Mr. Harris allowed himself a small smile, the kind that said he was no longer just a bus driver in their eyes, but a mentor who had taught them courage. The officers hesitated, feeling the weight of the situation slipping away from them. They were losing control, and fast. This wasn't the quiet compliance they'd expected. It was resistance, fueled by the innocence and raw honesty of kids who believed in something simple, that Mr. Harris deserved respect. Finally, the shorter officer glanced nervously at his partner. "Let's just wrap this up," he muttered, an edge of defeat in his voice. The taller officer shot him a look, as if still clinging to his authority, but he couldn't ignore the collective strength of the kids. He stepped back, barely concealing his frustration. "Fine," he grumbled, shoving Mr. Harris's license and registration back into his hands. "But don't think we won't be watching you." Mr. Harris took his documents with steady hands, his gaze never faltering. "Do what you have to do, officer," he replied calmly, feeling the silent cheers of the kids behind him. "You can watch all you want," he thought. But these kids just saw everything they need to know. As the officers returned to their car, the kids erupted in cheers. Jamal high-fived Maya, and even the usually shy Lily let out a triumphant shout. They had won, in their own way, standing together in the face of intimidation. They had faced something unfair, and they had stood their ground. Mr. Harris climbed back onto the bus, his eyes meeting each of theirs with gratitude. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, feeling a profound pride in the young hearts around him. "All right," he said, a soft smile spreading across his face. "Let's get you all to school." He eased back into the driver's seat, and as the bus rumbled to life, the kids' laughter and chatter filled the air once more. They were different now, stronger, more unified, and Mr. Harris knew this was a ride none of them would ever forget. But as they pulled away, Jamal glanced at his phone, a mischievous glint in his eye. "Hey, Mr. Harris," he said, holding up the video, "I think this one's going viral." The entire bus burst into laughter, the tension melting away as they realized they had done something powerful, something real. Mr. Harris chuckled, shaking his head. Maybe it was time the world saw these kids for who they truly were, courageous, compassionate, and unafraid to fight for what was right. The bus hummed as they pulled away from the scene, leaving the officers in their rearview mirror. Inside, the kids were abuzz with excitement, each voice overlapping the next in a rush of emotions. Relief, pride, disbelief. Mr. Harris glanced back at them, a soft smile playing on his lips. They had shown such bravery, such resilience. But deep down, he knew that what had just happened was more than a one-time event. It was a spark, something that could not be easily extinguished. A few hours later, when they reached the school, the kids scrambled off the bus, each of them giving Mr. Harris an extra nod, a smile, or a whispered thank you. Jamal lingered a moment longer, grinning as he held up his phone. "I already posted it, Mr. Harris. People need to see what happened." Mr. Harris chuckled, a mix of pride and apprehension flickering in his eyes. "Well, just remember, Jamal, we stood up for what's right. Now let's see what comes of it." By the end of the day, Jamal's video had spread far and wide. Parents, students, and even strangers were sharing it, adding comments of outrage, support, and calls for justice. By evening, local news stations had picked it up, running the clip alongside captions like "School bus driver harassed in front of students. A community outcry." Mr. Harris's phone buzzed continuously that night as messages poured in. Parents expressed their support, friends checked in, and even people he hadn't spoken to in years reached out, shocked and angered by what they had seen. He read each message, his heart heavy with gratitude and a newfound determination. The events of the day had rippled far beyond the bus, touching everyone who watched. But nothing prepared him for the scene he walked into the next morning. As he arrived at the school, he noticed a crowd gathering near the front steps. Parents, teachers, students, all stood holding signs with messages like "Justice for Mr. Harris" and "Stand up for our community." Some held handwritten posters that simply read, "Thank you, Mr. Harris." A wave of emotion swept over him as he stepped out of his car. He had always known he wasn't alone in his experiences, but seeing this display of solidarity was overwhelming. A group of parents approached him, shaking his hand, some with tears in their eyes. "Thank you for standing strong," one mother said, her voice choked with emotion. "Our kids look up to you. They needed to see someone like you show them what real courage looks like." Mr. Harris nodded, humbled. "Thank you. It was those kids who gave me courage," he replied, glancing over to where Jamal and a few others stood, their faces beaming with pride. Just then, a news reporter approached with a microphone, her expression serious but respectful. "Mr. Harris, may I ask how you're feeling about the support you've received since the video went viral?" He paused, choosing his words carefully. I'm just grateful," he said slowly, feeling the weight of each word. "Grateful for these kids who stood up when it mattered. Grateful for this community. And honestly, I hope that this serves as a reminder. No one should have to face this. Not here. Not anywhere." The reporter nodded, clearly moved by his response. But then, in a voice barely above a whisper, added, "Did you know there's a protest planned outside the police precinct?" Mr. Harris's eyes widened. "A protest?" "Yes. It started as a small gathering, but now people are gathering in support of you. They want answers. They want accountability." Mr. Harris's heart pounded. He hadn't asked for this, but somehow his personal ordeal had become a cause. He couldn't help but feel a mix of pride and anxiety. He worried for the students, for the ripple effects this might bring into their young lives. Yet he knew that some moments in life called for change, no matter the personal cost. Later that day, Mr. Harris decided to visit the protest, not to speak, but simply to stand with the people who had shown him so much support. As he approached the precinct, he saw dozens of people gathered, holding signs, chanting, united in their call for justice. And there, among the crowd, he spotted Jamal, standing proudly with a sign that read, "Our driver, our hero." Mr. Harris approached Jamal, who beamed when he saw him. "Mr. Harris, I knew you'd come." He placed a hand on Jamal's shoulder, his voice filled with emotion. "Thank you, Jamal, for everything. You and the others, you all did something incredible." Jamal looked up, his face serious. "You've always been there for us, Mr. Harris. We couldn't let them treat you like that." Just then, another reporter stepped forward, noticing Mr. Harris. "Mr. Harris, do you have a message for the police department?" He hesitated, the weight of the moment settling over him. "I just want respect. For me, for these kids, for our community. We all deserve that." His voice was calm, but unyielding, carrying the strength of someone who had seen too much but was still determined to stand tall. As he turned back to the crowd, he felt a hand slip into his. Lily, the quiet student who had spoken out on the bus, stood beside him, offering her support in her own quiet way. One by one, more students joined, standing alongside Mr. Harris, forming a circle around him as if to protect him from any harm that might come his way. The power of that moment, the unity of those gathered, was a force no one could ignore. As Mr. Harris stood surrounded by his students, parents, and neighbors, he felt an unbreakable strength flowing through him. This was no longer just his battle. It was the community's voice rising against something that had simmered beneath the surface for too long. The crowd continued to grow, chants echoing through the air as more people arrived, some carrying signs and others simply standing in solidarity. The city had come together in a way that Mr. Harris hadn't seen in years. Meanwhile, the police officers stationed at the precinct watched nervously from behind their windows. The protest was peaceful, but its message was undeniable. They had thought this incident would fade away, but here it was, larger than life, refusing to be ignored. Mr. Harris spotted a group of young reporters arriving on the scene, capturing the crowd's energy with their cameras and microphones. One of them caught sight of Mr. Harris and quickly approached. She was young, barely older than his own son, with a determined expression. "Mr. Harris, would you mind sharing your story for our viewers? People want to hear from you directly." He hesitated, the weight of the crowd's eyes on him. But then, looking around at the people who had supported him, he nodded. "I'll do it," he said softly, his voice steady but filled with emotion. Taking a deep breath, he faced the camera. "My name is David Harris, and I'm a school bus driver. I've worked in this city for over 15 years, picking up and dropping off kids who mean the world to me. They're my responsibility, and every day, I do my best to keep them safe and show them that they matter. But yesterday, I was made to feel like I didn't belong, like I was somehow wrong just for doing my job." He paused, feeling a surge of pain and pride. The crowd quieted, every ear tuned to his words. "But these kids," he gestured toward the students standing beside him. They stood up. They refused to let it happen in silence. And because of them, we're here today, together, asking for respect, for dignity, for justice. The crowd erupted in applause, and Mr. Harris's students cheered, their faces beaming with pride. Jamal, holding his sign high, yelled, "We're with you, Mr. Harris." His voice was joined by others, echoing through the crowd like a promise. But just then, the doors to the precinct opened, and a figure emerged. The police chief, flanked by a few officers. The chief's face was tense, his expression a mix of frustration and regret. He stepped toward Mr. Harris, signaling for the crowd's attention. The chants softened, curiosity and anticipation thickening the air. "Mr. Harris," the chief began, his voice steady but strained. "I've reviewed the footage, and I want to apologize for what happened. It was unprofessional, and it shouldn't have happened. The officers involved have been placed on administrative leave pending further investigation." The crowd murmured, some nodding in approval, others clearly dissatisfied. Mr. Harris listened intently, not sure what to make of this public display. He wanted to believe the chief's words, but experience had taught him to be cautious. But then, Lily stepped forward, her small hand gripping Mr. Harris's. She looked up at the police chief, her voice soft but unwavering. "Will you promise us it won't happen again?" The chief paused, caught off guard by the innocence and sincerity of her question. He knelt down, meeting Lily at eye level. "I'll do everything in my power to make sure it doesn't," he said, his voice gentler now. "I know you've all been through a lot, and I want to rebuild trust with you, with all of you." Lily nodded, as if she understood the weight of his words, and then looked up at Mr. Harris with a shy smile. Her courage, small but powerful, sent a ripple of hope through the crowd. Maybe, just maybe, things could be different. Just then, a voice called out from the crowd, cutting through the air like a spark. "Let's make this a turning point. Let's work together to create real change." The energy in the crowd shifted from anger to something brighter, more hopeful. Parents, teachers, students, and community members exchanged looks, nodding, as if all recognizing that this moment held a chance for real impact. They could turn this protest into a movement, one that could bring about lasting change. The police chief, recognizing the gravity of the moment, extended a hand to Mr. Harris. "Mr. Harris, I'd like to invite you to speak at the next city council meeting. Help us shape a program to ensure this kind of incident doesn't happen again. We need voices like yours." Mr. Harris looked at the chief's outstretched hand, feeling the weight of the decision. He glanced at Jamal, Lily, and the other students standing around him, their eyes filled with hope. He knew this was no longer about him alone. It was about the kids, about setting an example of resilience and unity. Taking a steady breath, he reached out, shaking the chief's hand firmly. "I'll do it. For them, for all of us," he replied, his voice strong and clear. The crowd erupted once more, this time in cheers of triumph. Mr. Harris felt a rush of emotion, the weight of his community's trust and support filling him with a purpose he hadn't known he needed. As he looked around, he saw a new beginning in the faces of his students and his neighbors. And as the sun began to set on that unforgettable day, Mr. Harris realized something important. They weren't just demanding change. They were becoming it. In the days leading up to the city council meeting, Mr. Harris found himself at the center of a wave of support he'd never anticipated. Everywhere he went, whether it was the local grocery store, his usual coffee shop, or even the park where he walked his dog, strangers would approach him, thanking him for standing up, for showing their kids courage and respect. Each interaction left him both humbled and overwhelmed. At home one evening, as he sat at his kitchen table preparing notes for the council meeting, he heard a knock on the door. When he opened it, there stood Jamal and Lily, along with a few other students and their parents, holding homemade cards and a cake. The students had organized a small gathering to cheer him on, showing up at his house with signs that read, "We believe in you," and "For our hero." "Mr. Harris," Jamal said, his voice soft but filled with admiration, "we just wanted to say thank you. You're not just our driver. You're like family to us. We wanted you to know we're here for you. Whatever you need, we'll be there." Lily stepped forward, holding out a card with a shy smile. "And, we made you this," she said, her cheeks pink. "It's from all of us." Inside the card, written in each student's handwriting, were small notes of encouragement, promises to support him at the meeting, and heartfelt thanks. Mr. Harris felt his chest tighten with emotion, blinking back the tears that threatened to fall. These kids, who he had watched grow over the years, were standing by him, giving him strength when he needed it most. "Thank you," he managed, his voice choked with emotion. "I don't have words. Just thank you." When the night of the council meeting arrived, the atmosphere was tense. The room was packed with parents, students, community members, and even a few police officers. Reporters lined the back wall, cameras ready, and the air buzzed with a quiet anticipation. Mr. Harris sat near the front, his heart pounding, trying to steady himself. His students and their families filled the rows behind him, their presence a powerful reminder of why he was there. As the meeting began, the city council members addressed the gathered crowd, each offering words of respect and commitment to ensuring accountability. But as Mr. Harris's turn to speak approached, the room fell silent, every eye fixed on him. He took a deep breath, rising to his feet, his hands steadying the paper with his notes. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice calm but filled with an unspoken strength. "My name is David Harris, and I'm a bus driver for this city. But I'm also a father, a friend, and a member of this community. And I'm here tonight to ask that we do better, not just for me, but for everyone who has ever felt dismissed, disrespected, or judged unfairly." He glanced back at his students, their eyes locked on him, their faces full of pride and support. "These kids," he continued, his voice steady, "they're the future of this city. They deserve to grow up in a place where respect is a given, not something they have to fight for. They shouldn't have to see their role models, the people who care for them, treated like less than they are." As he spoke, the audience remained silent, captivated by his words. Even the city council members leaned forward, their expressions softened. Mr. Harris paused, letting his words sink in. "I'm not here to point fingers or place blame," he continued. "I'm here to ask for change, for training, for accountability, for a commitment to understanding our community and treating each other with dignity. Because if we can't set that example, what are we teaching our kids?" The crowd erupted in applause, and Mr. Harris caught the eye of the police chief sitting nearby. The chief nodded respectfully, a look of agreement on his face, as if understanding the importance of Mr. Harris's words. Just as Mr. Harris was about to return to his seat, Jamal stood up from the audience, holding a small, crumpled paper. "Can I say something too?" he asked, looking around nervously. The council members exchanged glances. Then one of them nodded. "Go ahead, young man." Jamal stepped forward, his voice unsteady at first. "Mr. Harris has been there for us every day, picking us up, keeping us safe, and looking out for us. He's more than a driver. He's a friend. And when those officers treated him like that, it hurt all of us. It's not just about respect. It's about knowing that we matter. We need people like Mr. Harris to remind us of that." The room was silent as Jamal's words hung in the air, raw and powerful. Mr. Harris, filled with pride and emotion, watched as Jamal looked up at him with a grateful smile. By the end of the meeting, the council had agreed to implement new community-based training for officers, focusing on respect, empathy, and understanding the communities they served. Mr. Harris left the room that night, knowing they'd taken a meaningful step forward, not just for him, but for every person who'd ever felt unseen. As they walked out of the building, Jamal turned to Mr. Harris, a look of pure admiration on his face. "You did it, Mr. Harris," he said, grinning. "You really did it." Mr. Harris smiled, feeling the weight of the past few days lift from his shoulders. "No, Jamal," he replied, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We did it. All of us, together." And as they stood there, surrounded by the warmth and strength of their community, Mr. Harris knew that this was only the beginning. They had sparked something that couldn't be put out, an undeniable force of unity, respect, and the unbreakable bond of a community that had found its voice. The days following the city council meeting felt like a dream to Mr. Harris. Word of the changes he'd helped inspire spread across the city, and soon enough, even beyond. The story of a humble school bus driver standing up for respect had struck a chord with people everywhere. Messages flooded in from other drivers, teachers, parents, and students, all of whom shared their own stories of kindness, respect, and unity. One morning, as Mr. Harris arrived at the bus depot, he found his fellow drivers gathered around his bus, waiting for him. They greeted him with smiles, pats on the back, and a few lighthearted jokes, which he accepted with an embarrassed grin. They'd even tied a banner to his bus that read, "Our hero." He chuckled, feeling the familiar warmth of community support. "Look who's famous now," joked one driver, clapping him on the back. "You can't go anywhere in this city without people talking about you, David." Mr. Harris just shook his head, humbled. "I'm just doing what anyone would," he replied, but his friends shook their heads, disagreeing. "Nah, David, not everyone has the guts to stand up like you did." One of them replied, "You gave a voice to all of us." Later that day, as he picked up the kids for their usual route, he noticed something different in the air. The students, normally boisterous and playful, were seated a bit straighter, looking at him with admiration that went beyond their usual affection. Jamal, Maya, Lily, and a few others even made a point of sitting up front, surrounding him like a protective circle, as if to say, "We've got your back, Mr. Harris." As the bus rolled down its familiar route, A young boy named Ethan, usually quiet and a bit shy, approached the front. "Mr. Harris," he whispered shyly, "I just wanted to say thanks for, being brave." Mr. Harris smiled, touched by the boy's quiet sincerity. "Thank you, Ethan," he replied, his voice filled with warmth. "But I think all of you were the brave ones. Standing up like that, it wasn't easy. I'm proud of every single one of you." The bus filled with murmurs of agreement, and a newfound pride swept through the kids. They were starting to realize that standing up for what was right wasn't just something grown-ups did. It was something they could do, too. They'd made a difference, and they could see the ripple effects all around them. As they pulled up to the school, Mr. Harris noticed a small gathering of students, teachers, and parents by the entrance, holding signs and cheering as his bus came to a stop. The words on the signs ranged from "Respect our driver" to "Proud of our kids," each message reminding him just how powerful their stand had become. One of the teachers, Mrs. Monroe, approached him as he stepped off the bus, a warm smile on her face. "David, we just wanted to let you know how much we appreciate you. You've done more than just drive these kids. You've shown them what it means to be part of a community." Mr. Harris nodded, feeling the words sink in. "Thank you, Mrs. Monroe. I never thought any of this would happen," he admitted, glancing back at the bus where Jamal and the others waved from their seats, laughing and chatting with each other. "They've been my inspiration through it all." As the kids filed out of the bus, each one took a moment to give him a high five or a quick hug, their smiles wide and proud. Jamal lingered, giving him a grin and a thumbs up. "We did good, didn't we, Mr. Harris?" Mr. Harris chuckled, ruffling Jamal's hair. "Yes, we did. Better than good." Just then, Jamal's phone buzzed, and his eyes widened as he glanced at the screen. "Mr. Harris, look at this." He held the phone up, showing a message from a news outlet inviting Mr. Harris and the kids to share their story in a special feature. Mr. Harris felt a mix of surprise and pride. "You really think people want to hear from us, Jamal?" he asked, though the answer was clear in his heart. Jamal nodded enthusiastically. "Of course. People need to hear that standing up makes a difference." The story was picking up momentum, sparking conversations across communities, and even inspiring schools to organize assemblies about respect, empathy, and the importance of kindness. Each day, Mr. Harris received letters from parents thanking him for setting an example, and kids wrote notes saying they felt stronger, braver, more willing to speak up for what was right. One evening, as he sat by his kitchen window, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, Mr. Harris reflected on everything that had happened. The journey had been unexpected and at times overwhelming, but he knew now that he hadn't just stood up for himself. He'd stood up for the values that held his community together. He glanced at his phone, where a text message from Jamal waited, a simple yet powerful reminder. "Thanks for teaching us to be strong, Mr. Harris." And in that quiet moment, Mr. Harris knew his work wasn't done. He would continue to drive that bus, to look out for those kids, and to make sure that together, they keep moving forward on a path of unity, strength, and respect. As days turned into weeks, Mr. Harris's story continued to make waves. Schools across the district were holding assemblies on respect and fairness, inspired by what had happened on his bus. Community leaders reached out, asking him to speak at youth events and gatherings, and news articles poured in, each one sharing the powerful message of courage and unity. One Saturday morning, Mr. Harris was sitting with his morning coffee when his phone rang. The caller ID was unfamiliar, but he picked up anyway, curious. A warm voice greeted him on the other end. "Mr. Harris, this is Sarah Williams from the State Educators Association. We've been following your story, and we'd be honored if you would accept an award for outstanding service to the community at our annual banquet." Mr. Harris blinked, stunned. "Me? An award?" he stammered, trying to process the invitation. It was one thing to be thanked by the community, but to receive an official award felt like something out of a dream. "Yes, Mr. Harris," Ms. Williams continued, her tone full of admiration. "You've made a difference in ways that go beyond any classroom or school bus. You've shown these students, and all of us, the power of standing up for what's right. And we believe that deserves recognition." Humbled, he agreed to attend, though he still couldn't quite believe it. When he told the kids about the award on Monday, they erupted in cheers, their excitement more infectious than anything he'd ever felt. "We'll be there to cheer you on, Mr. Harris," Jamal declared with a grin, punching the air. "We wouldn't miss it for the world." As the banquet day arrived, Mr. Harris found himself dressed in a suit he hadn't worn in years, feeling both proud and nervous. When he arrived at the event hall, he was greeted by the sight of his students and their families filling an entire row of seats near the stage. Their faces lit up as they spotted him, waving and calling out words of encouragement. When his name was called, he took a deep breath, walking up to the podium amidst thunderous applause. The room was filled with people who had come to honor him, yet all he could think about were the kids who had been there from the start, who had shown him the true strength of unity and resilience. He looked out over the crowd, gathering his thoughts. "Thank you," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I never imagined I'd be standing here, receiving an award for just doing what I felt was right. But I realize now that this isn't just about me. This is about each person in this room, each student, parent, and teacher who believes in fairness and kindness." He paused, glancing toward the row where Jamal, Lily, and the others sat, their eyes shining with pride. "These kids," he continued, his voice filled with warmth, "they taught me what bravery really looks like. They showed me that change is possible, that we can stand up together to make a difference. So, this award isn't just mine. It belongs to every one of them." The applause swelled as he finished, and the students leapt to their feet, cheering wildly. Mr. Harris felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that his journey had touched so many lives. And as he walked off the stage, he was met by his students, who rushed forward to give him hugs, their faces glowing with admiration and joy. On the ride home, Jamal turned to Mr. Harris, grinning. "So, what's next for you, Mr. Harris? Think you'll start giving speeches full-time?" Mr. Harris chuckled, shaking his head. "No, I think I'll stick to my day job. But if there's one thing I know, it's that I'll keep standing up. Not just for myself, but for all of you." In the following weeks, Mr. Harris continued to inspire others, not through grand gestures, but by showing up each day with a renewed commitment to kindness, strength, and resilience. His bus route became more than just a ride to school. It became a symbol of what a single act of courage could spark. And one afternoon, as he watched his students board the bus, laughing and chatting, he realized that they, too, had been changed. They were more confident, more willing to stand up for each other, and more determined to make their voices heard. The journey that had started with a single moment of injustice had blossomed into something bigger, something that would leave an indelible mark on each of their lives. As they rounded the corner on their usual route, Lily looked up at him from her seat near the front, smiling brightly. "Thank you, Mr. Harris," she said simply, but with a sincerity that spoke volumes. Mr. Harris smiled back, his heart full. "Thank you, Lily. Thank you all. You've given me more than you'll ever know." And as they drove off into the afternoon sun, the bus filled with laughter and hope, Mr. Harris knew that this was just the beginning. For him, for his students, and for a community that had found new strength and unity, the future was bright. As the days passed, Mr. Harris noticed a new energy in his school and neighborhood. The story of his stand against injustice had become a source of inspiration for students, teachers, and parents alike. People from all backgrounds reached out, each story shared in a quiet way that created an unbreakable chain of resilience and unity. One afternoon, after dropping off the last group of students, Mr. Harris noticed the principal, Ms. Rivera, waving him over as he parked the bus. She wore a bright smile that suggested she had some news to share. "Mr. Harris," she began, "we've been talking with the district, and we thought, well, what better way to honor everything you and the kids have done than to start a new program?" She paused, letting the excitement build. "We want to create the David Harris Integrity and Respect Award, an annual award for students who exemplify courage, compassion, and kindness." Mr. Harris's jaw dropped, his heart pounding with pride and humility. I don't know what to say, Ms. Rivera." That's incredible," he stammered, his voice thick with emotion. Ms. Rivera smiled, her eyes soft with understanding. "We thought it was time the students had a real role model to look up to, and I can't think of anyone better for the job." She chuckled. "Besides, you're already their hero. As word of the new award spread, the excitement in the school grew. Students began writing essays on what integrity meant to them. Teachers held discussions on kindness, and a sense of purpose filled the halls. Jamal and Lily, feeling particularly proud, took it upon themselves to organize a small ceremony for the first award. The day of the ceremony arrived, and the entire school gathered in the auditorium, buzzing with anticipation. The students had filled the stage with banners and signs they'd painted themselves, each bearing messages of respect and unity. As Mr. Harris took his seat in the front row, he could feel the pride and support radiating from everyone around him. The principal stepped up to the podium, calling the auditorium to order. "Today," she announced, "we are here to celebrate not just an award, but the impact one person can have on an entire community. Mr. Harris, our beloved bus driver, showed us all what it means to stand up for each other. And I think we can all agree, he's much more than just a driver. He's a true friend to every student here." The room burst into applause, and Mr. Harris felt his cheeks warm as he humbly accepted the acknowledgement. But just as he thought the ceremony was over, Jamal stood up, a shy grin on his face as he approached the microphone. "We all wrote letters," Jamal announced, his voice echoing through the auditorium. "Letters to tell Mr. Harris how much he means to us." He held up a stack of letters, each one written by a student who wanted to share their gratitude. One by one, the students came forward, reading their words aloud, each letter a touching reminder of the impact Mr. Harris had made. Some spoke of moments he'd encouraged them, others of times he'd made them laugh on tough mornings. Lily, clutching her letter tightly, stepped up last, her voice soft but full of conviction. "Mr. Harris," she began, her eyes meeting his, "you taught us to be brave, even when it's scary. Because of you, I know I can stand up for myself and for others. You didn't just drive us to school, you helped us believe in ourselves." The words struck a deep chord, and Mr. Harris felt a tear slide down his cheek as he listened. He'd always wanted to make a difference, but seeing it reflected back to him in the faces of these students felt like the greatest honor of his life. After the ceremony, Mr. Harris found himself surrounded by students and teachers alike, each eager to shake his hand, to share a hug, or simply to say thank you. Jamal grinned, tugging on his sleeve. "So, Mr. Harris, what do you think about being famous?" Mr. Harris laughed, ruffling Jamal's hair. "Famous, huh? I think I'm just grateful to know you all." The afternoon stretched into evening, with students laughing, taking photos, and celebrating their shared moment of pride. And as he watched them, Mr. Harris knew that they were ready to take on the world, stronger, more confident, and united by the values they'd built together. Just as the event began to wind down, the school's social media account posted a picture of Mr. Harris standing with his students, the headline reading, "Integrity in Action: How One Bus Driver Changed Our Community." The post quickly went viral, spreading the story of Mr. Harris and his students even further. Comments poured in from people across the country, each one sharing how the story had inspired them. As he finally left the school that evening, Mr. Harris felt lighter than he ever had before. He had always believed in the power of kindness, but now he knew kindness had a ripple effect, touching lives in ways he'd never imagined. And though he'd returned to his regular bus route the next day, his heart brimmed with the knowledge that he had helped change not only his students, but his entire community. The future stretched ahead, bright and full of promise, for him and for the students who had been by his side every step of the way. And as he walked away from the school, he smiled, grateful for every twist, every turn, and every person who had been part of the journey. A few weeks after the ceremony, Mr. Harris found himself settling back into his routine, but something was undeniably different. The students were closer, their bond with him stronger, and even the simplest of moments on the bus held a new depth. As he drove them each morning, the students would share their dreams, their worries, and their latest achievements, and he felt honored to be part of their lives in such a meaningful way. One bright Monday morning, as he pulled up to the school, a familiar face was waiting for him. It was Ms. Rivera, the principal, but this time she wasn't alone. Standing beside her was a tall, gray-haired man in a sharp suit who looked around with an air of quiet authority. When Mr. Harris stepped off the bus, Ms. Rivera approached him, a twinkle of excitement in her eyes. "David," she began, gesturing to the man beside her, "this is Mr. John Stevenson from the State Department of Education. He's here to see you." Mr. Harris blinked, surprised and slightly confused. "To see me?" "Yes," Mr. Stevenson replied with a kind smile. "We've heard your story across the district and beyond. Your impact has gone further than you might realize." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a neatly folded piece of paper, handing it to Mr. Harris. "We'd like to extend an invitation for you to join our advisory board, working directly with us to bring community-centered values into our schools across the state." The words took a moment to settle in, and Mr. Harris felt a wave of astonishment. An advisory board? Him, a bus driver, advising on education policy? He stammered, struggling to find the words. I don't know what to say. I'm just a school bus driver." Mr. Stevenson shook his head. "No, Mr. Harris. You are much more than that. You're a leader, an inspiration. We need voices like yours, people who understand the community, who know what it's like to be on the front lines every day." Ms. Rivera gave him an encouraging nod. "I think you'd be perfect for it, David. Imagine the impact you could have helping shape the lives of even more students." The prospect was both thrilling and overwhelming. Mr. Harris had never seen himself as more than a steady, guiding presence for his students. But now, faced with this new opportunity, he realized that he could make an even bigger difference. He thought of his students, Jamal, Lily, Maya, all the kids who had shown him that strength and kindness knew no age, that even the smallest voice could echo loudly in the right moment. He nodded, his smile widening as he accepted the invitation. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady with newfound determination. "I would be honored to be part of this." The news quickly spread, and by that evening, Mr. Harris's students and their families had gathered at his house with balloons and banners, celebrating their beloved bus driver's newest journey. Jamal, ever the ringleader, handed him a handmade card, a proud grin on his face. "See? We told you you're famous," he teased, and everyone laughed. Days turned into weeks, and Mr. Harris attended his first advisory board meeting, bringing with him the values he'd spent a lifetime cultivating: integrity, empathy, and respect. He spoke from the heart, drawing from his experiences, and found that people listened, truly listened. His simple yet profound insights resonated, and soon, policies began to shift in small but meaningful ways. Back in his community, Mr. Harris remained the same steadfast figure, still driving the bus, still greeting each student with a warm smile and an encouraging word. But now, he knew his reach went beyond his bus route, his impact stretching to students he'd never even met. One afternoon, as he drove his usual route, Jamal leaned forward from his seat, his voice thoughtful. "Mr. Harris, do you think we really made a difference?" Mr. Harris glanced in the rearview mirror, meeting Jamal's questioning gaze. "You tell me," he replied with a smile. "What do you think?" Jamal grinned, looking around at his friends. "Yeah, I think we did. Maybe more than we even know." The entire bus nodded in agreement, and Mr. Harris felt a swell of pride. It was true. What had started as a moment of courage on a regular school day had grown into something extraordinary. And every day, he saw the ripple effects in his students, in his community, and even in himself. As they drove through the streets, the afternoon sun casting a golden glow over the neighborhood, Mr. Harris realized he was exactly where he was meant to be, surrounded by the very students who had changed his life as much as he had changed theirs. And though the journey was still unfolding, he knew, deep in his heart, that together they had created something lasting, a legacy of respect, resilience, and the unbreakable bonds of a community that stood up for one another, no matter what. As the school year progressed, Mr. Harris's role continued to evolve, with new responsibilities on the advisory board and fresh ideas for fostering respect and empathy within the district. But even with all the changes, he remained committed to his bus route, greeting each student with the same warm smile he always had, no matter what awaited him after the morning drop-off. One chilly December morning, the students climbed aboard the bus, bundled in scarves and hats, their faces flushed with excitement. Christmas decorations adorned the town streets, and the festive spirit was infectious. Jamal sat at the front, bouncing in his seat as he waited for Mr. Harris to pull away. "You know, Mr. Harris," Jamal said with a mischievous grin, "we've been working on a little project, but we can't tell you what it is just yet." Mr. Harris chuckled, giving Jamal a skeptical look in the rearview mirror. "Oh, another one of your projects, Jamal? Should I be worried?" Jamal just grinned, winking at Lily and Maya, who shared knowing smiles. "You'll see soon enough," he replied cryptically. As the days passed, Mr. Harris noticed the students whispering, exchanging secretive glances, and even huddling together during recess. Whatever this project was, it had his entire bus involved, and he couldn't help but feel a mix of curiosity and anticipation. Finally, the last day before winter break arrived, and as Mr. Harris pulled up to the school that morning, he was met with an unusual sight. The entire front lawn of the school had been transformed into a winter wonderland, with handmade decorations, twinkling lights, and a large banner that read, "Thank you, Mr. Harris, our hero, our friend." His heart skipped a beat as he took it all in, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of the display. But as he stepped off the bus, the real surprise came. The students and their families gathered around him, each holding letters and cards they'd written themselves, sharing stories of how he'd impacted their lives. Jamal, standing at the front, held a large scrapbook covered in photos, drawings, and messages from every student he'd driven over the years. "We wanted to give you something to remember us by," Jamal said, his voice cracking with emotion. "You've been there for us, Mr. Harris, through everything, and now it's our turn to give something back." Mr. Harris's eyes filled with tears as he flipped through the scrapbook. Each page held memories he'd almost forgotten. A drawing from Lily when she was in second grade, a photo of Jamal as a little boy, grinning toothily from his seat at the back of the bus, and messages from students who had graduated, thanking him for the encouragement he'd given them along the way. Unable to find the words, Mr. Harris looked up, his gaze meeting each of his students and their families. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the lump in his throat. "Thank you all more than I can say." Then, out of nowhere, one of the younger students, a little girl named Emily, reached up and wrapped her arms around him in a hug. Her small voice broke the silence as she said, "We love you, Mr. Harris." At that moment, the whole group seemed to move closer, each person offering their own words of gratitude and admiration, until Mr. Harris was surrounded by the warmth of his community. People who had come together, not just because of his impact on them, but because of the strength and unity they discovered through him. And just as Mr. Harris thought the surprises were over, Ms. Rivera approached with a final announcement. "Mr. Harris, on behalf of the school and the entire district, we'd like to present you with this honorary plaque." She handed him a beautifully engraved plaque that read, "David Harris, for inspiring a generation with compassion and strength." Applause erupted, and Mr. Harris felt a deep, unshakable sense of fulfillment. He had always believed in small, quiet acts of kindness, but standing there, surrounded by the community he'd helped build, he realized that those small acts had woven together into something far bigger and more lasting than he'd ever imagined. As the applause died down, Jamal raised his hand, calling for attention. "And now, let's take a picture," he announced, waving everyone to gather around Mr. Harris. With laughter and playful shouts, the students and parents gathered, crowding close as a photographer captured the moment. Mr. Harris standing proudly, a shining example of the power of kindness, with his arms around the very people who had given him strength. As the crowd began to disperse, Mr. Harris looked down at the scrapbook, flipping through the pages with a sense of awe and gratitude. Each memory, each smiling face, was a reminder of the journey they'd taken together, one that had transformed not only their school but their entire community. And as he prepared to drive the students home one last time before the holiday break, he knew that their journey was far from over. This was just the beginning of a legacy of kindness, unity, and strength, one that would carry on in the hearts of everyone he'd touched. When he finally started the bus and looked back at his students, he smiled, his voice full of warmth. "All right, everyone, let's go home." And as they drove off, the bus filled with the laughter, hope, and boundless spirit of a community that would always be united by a simple, unbreakable bond of kindness. After the winter break, life returned to its familiar rhythm. Yet, the spirit of togetherness and kindness lingered, transforming every day into something a little brighter. The students boarded Mr. Harris's bus with an unmistakable glow, and he knew their bond was stronger than ever. Each morning, they shared their dreams and laughed over memories, and Mr. Harris felt like he was part of a family that grew with each ride. Then, one rainy morning, Mr. Harris noticed something unusual at one of his stops. Standing with the students was an elderly woman, her umbrella angled against the rain, watching as the kids climbed aboard. When Mr. Harris pulled up, she gave him a warm smile, stepping forward to introduce herself. "Mr. Harris," she began, her voice soft but confident. "I'm Mrs. Thompson. I'm one of Jamal's neighbors. I've heard so much about you, and I felt it was time I finally met the famous bus driver myself." Mr. Harris chuckled, a little taken aback. "Well, it's an honor, Mrs. Thompson. Jamal's a good kid, one of the best." She nodded, her gaze filled with appreciation. "Thank you, Mr. Harris. I just wanted to say how much your story has inspired all of us in the community. The way you've shown these kids kindness, the way you've stood up for what's right, it reminds me of how my late husband was when he worked as a teacher. He always believed in showing kindness and leading by example." Her words hung in the air, carrying a depth of emotion that touched Mr. Harris deeply. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. That means a lot to me," he replied, humbled. As the bus pulled away, Mr. Harris couldn't help but think about Mrs. Thompson's words. He realized that his journey with the students had created something far-reaching, something that had touched even those he hadn't met. It was as though the kindness they'd fostered on that bus had taken on a life of its own, branching out to touch every part of the community. Later that week, as Mr. Harris drove his route, he noticed something even more surprising. Along the bus stops were handmade signs, each one bearing messages like, "Thank you, Mr. Harris," and "Keep spreading kindness." Students and parents alike had taken it upon themselves to put up these messages as a tribute, and seeing them filled Mr. Harris with a new sense of pride and gratitude. When they reached the school that day, Jamal handed Mr. Harris a small envelope, grinning mischievously. "It's from all of us," he said with a wink. Curious, Mr. Harris opened the envelope. Inside was a letter addressed to the David Harris Integrity Fund, and beneath it, a collection of donations from students, parents, and community members who wanted to start a fund in his name. The goal? To support programs in local schools that promoted kindness, unity, and empathy, ensuring that Mr. Harris's message would continue to reach future generations. Mr. Harris felt his heart swell, barely able to process the generosity of those around him. "Jamal, everyone, this is incredible. I can't believe you all did this," he stammered, his voice thick with emotion. Jamal shrugged, flashing his usual grin. "It's the least we could do, Mr. Harris. You've given so much to us. Now, it's our turn to give back to you." Touched beyond words, Mr. Harris could only nod, pulling Jamal and the others into a warm hug. The students' laughter filled the air, and he realized that they were as proud of this fund as he was. Together, they had built something enduring, something that would keep growing long after they'd all moved on.